This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this week's video, we're looking at non-blue counterspells. The ability to counter spells or activated abilities is almost exclusively the domain of blue mages. There are almost 300 different blue counterspells. However, other colors do get some counterspells. There are 42 non-blue cards that can counter spells or activated abilities. Most of these are very narrow and specific, and most of them are just sort of weaker forms of counterspells since they have to make it all make sense in the color pie. In all, 13 of those 42 non-blue counterspells have at least one Grand Prix or Pro Tour top 8. In this video, we're going to talk about the 10 of those that have made the biggest impact on competitive Magic, while also talking about the interesting design of non-blue counterspells. Before we get started, I want to be specific about what I mean by non-blue counterspells. To qualify for this list, a card had to not involve blue mana at all when countering a spell. This means that multicolored cards don't make the list, nor do counterspells with Devoid, which, while technically colorless, still cost blue mana. It also means that cards that aren't blue but have activated abilities that counter spells and cost blue mana aren't eligible for this list. One last thing before we go to number 10, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now let's go to number 10. At number 10 we have Bind, a green spell that counters activated abilities and also draws you a card, so it is usually going to have no problem giving you considerable value if you can cast it. Countering an activated ability alone is sometimes not worth a whole card, except in certain circumstances, so adding the cantrip really does go a long way towards making it better. While blue has primacy in terms of countering both spells and activated abilities, it has been established by cards like this that green can counter activated abilities, and is the only other color that can do that. It picked up one Grand Prix top 8 each in Standard and Extended between 2002 and 2003. Both of these formats had enough problematic cards with activated abilities that having Bind available in the sideboard of green decks was pretty nice. It hasn't seen play anywhere since 2003 though. At number 9 is Manatide, which I feel like is one of the more well-known non-blue counterspells around. In Time Spiral Block, Wizards printed a number of color-shifted cards. In many ways, the main purpose here was to showcase things that had changed over the years about the color pie. These were all cards that were functionally identical to some other card from the past, apart from the fact that these new cards were a different color. Manatide is a color-shifted Force Spike. So, how did it make sense that a card originally printed as a blue counterspell could now be white? Well, for a while at least, Wizards had decided that white's tax theme, where it can make spells cost more and things like that, could be extended to counterspells, like Manatide. While obviously this type of counterspell can become weaker as the game goes on, there are usually multiple times throughout the game where it can hit an opponent's spell, and maybe even allow you to trade up since you're only paying 1 mana. In Extended, it was played in white aggro decks where it could be pretty effectively used against removal or board sweepers to keep the damage on the board. It also has one modern Grand Prix top 8 and a Jeskai control deck. It works in Control too because it lets you punish an opponent who is trying to curve out by cheaply countering one of their creatures. It hasn't seen play since 2013, but I think in the right metagame, it is the kind of card that might emerge again. At number 8 is Life Force, a color-hosing counterspell. As we can see here, and as we'll see in a few other cards on this list, counterspells can also make sense when it involves some type of color hosing between colors that don't like each other. Green is the color of life, black the color of death, so green mages should have a way of countering black, right? And that's what Life Force, which is as old as the game of Magic, does. It's also why it has kind of weird text where it mentions destroying a spell instead of countering it. Although it is kind of interesting that there were blue cards in Alpha that do say counter target spell, and this doesn't. Obviously now the Oracle text does say counter, but it is sort of an interesting choice of words on this card. Life Force managed a top 8 at the first 2 professional Magic tournaments ever, Worlds in 1994 and Worlds in 1995. In both cases, it was in a green aggro deck sideboard. At number 7, we have a white creature who can counter some spells, and that's Frontline Medic. We've already seen from the first few cards on this list that non-blue counterspells are usually very specific and narrow, and that's what we have here too. An activated ability that only counters X spells. Frontline Medic isn't a counterspell and nothing else. Instead, he's also a 3-mana 3/3 who makes your whole board indestructible if attacking with some friends friends, and obviously that's where a lot of his value comes from. However, his other activated ability was a real nuisance to tack on to an already powerful creature, especially because the block and standard of his time had powerful X spells like Bonfire of the Damned and Sphinx's Revelation. In typical white fashion, it isn't a hard counter either. Instead, your opponent can pay 3 to avoid the spell from being countered altogether. Your opponent should also know it is coming, since it's in play, so the actual number of spells that Frontline Medic countered is probably actually pretty small, but he did basically make those powerful X spells weaker by forcing players to pay for his tax. Frontline Medic was a really dynamic creature for aggro decks in Standard and Block, between just being a great creature for aggro and really messing with 2 of the best cards in the format. At number 6 we have Null Brooch, an artifact that can counter spells. As we continue to see, non-blue counter spells are often narrow and have higher costs. Null Brooch can only counter non-creatures, and it makes you discard your whole hand. On the other hand, it is a repeatable counterspell, and that's not the most commonly occurring thing in this game. Additionally, if you have 0 cards in your hand, the downside here is pretty much gone since you have no hand to discard. Null Brooch has seen play sporadically over the years, never putting up points in consecutive years, and with a 14-year gap with no points at all between 2003 and 2017. Despite all of the decks it was in being from very different times and even in different formats, Null Brooch has always been played in the same kind of deck, those that run Tinker. These artifact-heavy decks like running singleton copies of certain cards that are only good situationally, and Null Brooch is one of those. If it looks like you're going to need to stop a combo or something else your opponent is doing with a non-creature spell, it is time to tinker it up and start keeping your opponent from doing what they want to do. While Null Brooch hasn't seen play anywhere since 2017, I don't think you can ever count out a card with a resume like this one that has seen play in multiple different eras and formats decades apart. At number 5, we have another white counterspell, Lapse of Certainty. This white counterspell has a different design than most of the other ones, which ask players to pay a tax like Manatide. Instead, this is an actual hard counter in a color other than blue. The only catch is that it puts the card back on top of your opponent's library, so you're really only gaining a bit of tempo off of the card and maybe just delaying the inevitable. That means this isn't really the kind of counterspell a more controlling deck wants. Instead, decks that can end the game quickly are more interested in this, as they can use this to counter a board sweeper or problematic blocker and keep the opponent from stabilizing, and then kill the opponent with an Alpha Strike. In Standard, it was played in Boros aggro, and in Extended, it was played in White Weenie decks. Both of these are pretty typical aggro decks that like citing in Lapse of Certainty in the right matchup. At number 4, we have Stromgald Cabal, a creature who can counter spells with an activated ability, but it is another color hosing type counterspell since this one can only counter white spells. That said, against someone playing white, this is immensely powerful as, like Null Brooch, it is a counterspell that you can use over and over again. Black and white are enemy colors, so it never feels wrong to have a black card that can counter white spells. The Cabal was a common sideboard card for mono black decks between 1995 and 1999, who would cite it in, obviously enough, against opponents who were playing decks that were predominantly white. At number 3 is Guttural Response, an extremely narrow counterspell whose main purpose is to hate on blue counterspells. Red and green are the most oppositional to blue, and the two of them, apart from blue, are the colors to most frequently receive cards that can't be countered, so this makes perfect sense in terms of the color pie. Obviously, it can counter more than just counterspells. It can be any blue instant, but a huge percentage of blue instants you're going to encounter are going to be counterspells. Even the flavor text of the card indicates that's how this should be used. Since it costs hybrid mana, it can also be played in a wide variety of decks that aren't interested in being disrupted by blue counter magic. What decks like being disrupted by counter magic the least? Combo decks, and that's where Guttural Response has mostly seen play. In Standard, it was used in Storm decks. In Extended and Modern, it was played in Scapeshift decks. More recently in Modern, it was used to protect the Krark Clan Ironworks combo, but it was recently banned out of the format and it hasn't seen play since 2018. I can almost assure you, though, that Modern combo decks in the future, at some point, will be interested in running Guttural Response. At number 2, we have Warping Wail, the second and final colorless card that can counter spells to make the list. Like most of the counterspells on this list, Warping Wail is narrow, only capable of countering sorceries. However, Warping Wail has a cool modal design where it has 3 rather narrow effects, and it turns out if you cram a bunch of situational options onto a single card, the situations where you want to use one of them come up a lot more often. Warping Wail does ask for some more difficult mana requirements than most colorless cards, as you have to have at least 1 colorless mana to cast it. The Standard it was part of had a major colorless theme though, and having the right mana to cast it wasn't a huge issue. It wasn't an all-star in the format though, managing only 5 points. Modern is where it is done the most. It is a format where Tron is a tier 1 deck, and obviously the Tron lands have no problem providing you with the necessary colorless mana. In Legacy, it sees play in Eldrazi aggro decks, which are almost entirely made up of lands that produce colorless mana. Warping Whale continues to see play, and as a result, it will probably always hold down the number 2 spot on this list. However, the card, or should I say cards, at number 1 on this list are way out of reach for Warping Whale, which are the almost functionally identical Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. These are some narrow counterspells that showcase the oppositional attitudes of blue and red. There's also a Blue Elemental Blast, for example. These cards are incredibly powerful against blue opponents because they can not only counter blue spells, they can destroy blue permanents, and only for 1 mana. That's some insane efficiency. Since these were printed, they have been continuously present at Magic's highest level. These days, they are only legal in Legacy and Vintage, but they still continue to see a ton of play there. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the MTG Top 10s I've done in the past, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.